Ever since your grandmother's was a child, there has been a great debate that has lasted for decades. Could video games make people more violent? Could killing people in fiction make you or I want to kill people in real life? Would spending 10 hours straight every day playing games like Assassin's Creed, League of Legends, Call of Duty, or Barbie's fashion simulator be enough to turn our beautiful little children into bloodthirsty criminals? Well, accordingly to our current president here in Brazil, yes, who not only revoked all tax breaks on video games, but now has approved a legal framework to regulate the video game industry in Brazil. But of course, all of that changes when you're trying to get elected. In other words, it is okay if you're a kid and you see two gay people kissing. That certainly doesn't influence your child to be gay at all. But if those people are kissing in a video game, well then it seems like it's time to intervene, right? By the way, just play The Last of Us Part 2, it is amazing. Anyway, parallel to this discussion of video games, another thing that makes this type of conversation even more frequent today is also some current and recent news about massacres in schools. But whenever it happens, many people/journalistic media easily associate these events with video games. After all, if you're using your television for other things like using the internet, watching YouTube, or even just playing video games, it is very difficult for you to end up in this sorts of news. Not just about massacres, but about the opinions that try to explain why they happen as well. But beyond this reason, there also seems to be a correlation between boys being the population that plays video games the most and the people who commit these types of crimes also being almost all of the time male. So when this kind of thing happens, the first thing that comes to mind and to these journals is to easily categorize these individuals as monsters and psychopaths and associate their behaviors with video games, period, without making a distinction. In criminal law, there's a term called mens rea, which explains the mental state of a defendant who's accused of committing a crime, which in jurisdiction, most crimes require proofs for both the mens rea and actus reus, which is the statement of objective crime committed, before the defendant can be found guilty, of course. In other words, how many people really stop to understand why these things happen before making any judgments? After all, if this happens so often, shouldn't we be trying to understand why does this happens? I mean, starting with simple questions like, who is doing this? Why are they doing it? And what lead these people to get to this situation? But before asking these questions, let's look at some statistics. First, in the case of school shootings, and taking into account Brazil, which has around 750,000 schools from preschool to high school, we see that the number of times that an attack has occurred is relatively low, having happened 24 times between 2002 and 2019. At least that's what it used to be, because since February 2022, these numbers have increased from 24 to 36. That is, 1/3 of the attacks we have in our country have happened only in the past 2 years. But then we go to the United States, that in other hand, 34 accidents involving firearms in schools were recorded only in 2013 alone. That is, in 1 year, the Americans managed to have what took Brazil more than 20 years. And from 1966 to 2023, the total number of mass shootings in schools in the US was 172, while mass shootings in general have been more than 385 only in 2024. And they say Rio de Janeiro is a thing, right? Let's just say that these numbers are so alarming in the US that even South Park has an entire episode dedicated to this part of the American culture, in which the boys enter the school while a shooting is happening. And for them, everything is just a normal day. It's not even one of the main focuses of the episode. It's just something that happens there in the background, and they simply don't give a damn. In fact, they don't even talk about it. And despite everything, it's quite funny. I really like this episode. America is so crazy that the most popular game you guys have is about stealing cars and entering gun stores as if they were bakeries. And actually, there seems to be more gun dealers in the US than there are of bakeries registered, at least in Brazil. Americans are so crazy that you guys try to shoot your own candidate for president with a sniper. Well, we also tried to kill ours, but it was with a knife at least. But anyway, this information already opens up two profiles for us. The first, there's a tendency for people who commit these massacres and even shootings to be male. Normally to be teenagers or young adults. Second, there is a tendency for these events to happen in specific places, probably linked with the social circles of these individuals. In this case, it could be schools as well. However, just because men are more likely to be school shooters doesn't mean that all men will end up becoming school shooters. If you studied basic math in school, you probably know this. And if you didn't or you forgot, I made this Venn diagram in Microsoft Paint so you can understand it better. After all, different people end up having different futures. And some of these men end up being bricklayers, others become gym bros, others end up being arrested, and many unfortunately end up selling courses on the internet just like me, buy my course and buy my book. Others do digital marketing, or even worse, many of them end up on Discord. In a video of this guy here on YouTube, he talks about how many young males today like several things, from a present father, good influences, life goals, mentors, and especially sex. And today we're going to try to analyze much deeper into these topics, and we are going to address how these deficiencies can generate certain specific behaviors. So in today's video, we are going to delve in first, what is a school massacre? And using psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy, ask ourselves, what makes people commit this kind of thing? Second, is it something that only happens now? Is it something that only depends on our society? Or are there previous factors that determine this type of thing? And three, why do men have a tendency to commit this type of crimes? Why do we never see women doing this sort of thing? Or rather, do women have any role, or should they have any role in these attacks? Is the Brazilian president or your grandmother right all along? Well, that's what we are going to try to find out. And finally, it is not easy to discuss this type of subject, but it is important to do so that we can better understand and perhaps even prevent these strategies. After all, the things we least want to talk about, discuss, and look upon are the things that we need the most. On April 20, 1999, at Columbine High School in Colorado, former students Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold killed 12 classmates and a teacher before committing suicide. The shooters planned the massacre for more than a year and a half and left a trail of clues in diaries, videos, and online messages. They were frequently bullied at school and had been expelled for violent behavior shortly before the massacre. And in their journals, Eric and Dylan expressed a sense of superiority over other students. They considered themselves intellectually superior, looked down on those they considered inferior, and even associated themselves with a divine image, which is very interesting to say. Because despite their statements demonstrating some kind of superiority, what happened then at the school seemed to be the opposite. After all, both Eric and Dylan had been expelled from school shortly before the massacre, and seemed to suffer from major cases of bullying, which was just one of the motivations for their behavior. Therefore, the claim of superiority is somewhat strange. It was Alfred Adler, an Austrian psychiatrist, who coined the terms inferiority and superiority complexes. But to Adler, they were really one of the same. That is, the more a person wanted to appear bigger and superior, the more he was actually compensating for opposite feelings, a feeling of being smaller than other people and inferior than them. On the day of the massacre, Eric and Dylan placed homemade bombs in the school hallways and opened fire on students and teachers. Their goal was to kill as many as people as possible and cause as much damage to the school as possible as well. Known as the Columbine Massacre, this event had a huge impact in American society, sparking debates about gun control and bullying in schools. It also inspired several other school massacres in the United States and perhaps around the world. And to this date, the date of the massacre is often remembered as a day of mourning in the country. Still, in the diaries, besides some very teenage things like hearts and secret declarations about being in love with a student at school, there were some verses about getting revenge, especially on some police officers who, some time before, had arrested them for trying to steal some computers. The day chosen for the massacre, April 20, is also coincidentally the same date as Adolf Hitler's birthday, which led many newspapers and people to speculate that the boys were linked to Nazism. However, none of this was ever confirmed, and despite the misrepresentations of judgment, they even wrote in their diaries about how they disliked racists, implying that the hatred that they had was not linked to race, was not linked to ethnicity. It was really something beyond that. And despite this, even if this specific massacre did not have any Nazi-related issues, many other school shootings certainly do, including this one that happened here in Brazil, of a boy, a 16-year-old boy, who apparently wore a mask with a swastika while attacking a primary and secondary school in Espírito Santo. But that wasn't the only one either. Many people who tend to commit this type of crimes like to use these symbols. But the most interesting thing is that when you see the story of these boys, especially one who is 16 years old and who lives in Brazil, it's quite easy to imagine that these people had no real knowledge of what Nazism is, or even what Jews are, or even where they came from. At least in Brazil, we don't have this sort of culture, or even the reasons why the Nazis hated them so much. In fact, there are even adults who called others Nazis who, without even knowing the answer to any of these questions either, who are the Jews and why the Nazis hated them. Something that was really common to see on Twitter. But anyway, in other words, there is something not only in school shooters, but also in the general population in using these types of symbols, not only to express some hatred or to categorize people as Nazis, but many times these symbols are used only to shock, to express strong feelings, and not to say what they truly represent. Nowadays, calling someone Hitler or Nazi is nothing more than a cathartic movement to express strong emotions against something you don't like. And if many of these teenagers end up identifying with the symbols, what does that mean for them? Maybe it's the fact that these symbols are controversial and, as we said earlier, they generate strong emotions in anyone who hears them. Maybe it's the fact that these symbols are controversial and, as I said a moment ago, they generate strong emotions in anyone who hears them. And when that happens, when you generate these strong emotions in someone, it's very easy to think that maybe you have control over that person. And if you speak, show, or generate strong emotions in a large number of people, what do you gain from that? When your words are able to have an effect, a direct effect on others, what does that mean about you? Maybe that if you say more of these things, you might be able to have control over them. And imagining that the people who are the most famous today are able to generate emotions in other people, such as musicians, singers, actors, politicians, and famous personalities, and so on, even if you don't gain a direct quote-unquote control over them or just fame, you will certainly at least have their attention. In a song by German industrial metal Rammstein, Ich will, the singer constantly repeats these two words, which means I want. Well, the video shows a scene of a bank robbery with gunmen making demands to release the hostages. They say, "Ich will," and then complement with some other wish. For example, "I want to feel you looking at me. I want to hear your voice screaming," or even "I want to disturb the peace." Until they finally say, "Ich will jede Herzschlag kontrollieren." I want to control every beat of your heart. Now, if you're listening to it in another context, the words of the song might refer to a love song. But if you're watching with the video, it's all transformed into a context of people just wanting to do certain things to get attention from others, which, well, might still sound like a love song nevertheless. And even though this song was released in the early 2000s, it also says a lot about our current society 20 years later, where everyone seems to have a YouTube channel, an Instagram and TikTok account, and constantly try to do flashy and risky things for nothing less than a few likes and views. What these people want are exactly those things too. For people to see them, for them to hear their voices and comments, for them to be shocked and, in a way, be held hostage by controlling their attention of whoever is watching them. And some mechanisms such as likes, comments, and views are just the reflections of this. After all, this means that you have really gained the attention of those people, which often leads to an attitude of speak ill or speak well. The important thing is to speak of me. But something even more interesting to ask would be, what does it mean to gain attention? And why do so many people want it? What leads TikTokers to burn 75% of their bodies, end up in emergency rooms, and taking several risky actions just to gain it? What is so valuable about other people's attention, and why do we want it so much? Well, perhaps a man from the 19th century will be able to help us understand that. We know that concentrated action causes sexual excitement. It is possible to suppose that acting in the same way, but in the opposite direction, the state of sexual excitement influences the availability of attention. Much of the symptomatology of neurosis, which I relate to disorder of sexual processes, manifests itself in disorder of other non-sexual functions of the body. And this effect, incomprehensible until now, becomes less mysterious if it represents only the counterpart of influences that govern the production of sexual excitement. 3 Essays on Theory of Sexuality, Sigmund Freud. Well, thanks, Sigmund. That was enlightening. Now, in another psychoanalytic interpretation of this, it is also possible to imagine what the psychoanalysts call helplessness, which will be nothing more than the fact of imagining how you and I, even before we were born, from the 9 months of our gestation and for another 2 years after we were born, and for even 10 years at least during all this time, we lived and built on the basis of our existence through the care of another person or other people. And when we grow up and realize that there is no one there to hold our hand when we fall, to offer us comfort when we need it, this feeling is called helplessness, and is built into every human being. Therefore, when a baby cries, screams, and kicks, he may do so to get attention and consequently gain something from it, which will keep him alive here on earth. But when he grows up, perhaps crying and screaming and kicking as an adult, these actions might not be the best way to gain, well, whatever this person wants. In the words of Freud himself, the human organism is initially incapable of performing this specific action. It is affected by outside help. When the attention of an experienced person is drawn to an infantile state by discharge through the pathway of alteration, this pathway of discharge requires an all-important secondary function of communication, and the initial helplessness of human being is a primary source of moral motives. Project for scientific psychology. Now, if you don't like psychoanalysis all that much, we can look at another approach of psychology, for example, the evolutionary psychology, which compares these aspects of Darwin's theory of natural selection, which says how not only species evolve over time, but also various mechanisms that we have evolved also to adapt to the environment in which we live over thousands and thousands of millions of years. From this perspective, we can see that the search for attention and social status can be seen as an evolutionary mechanism that helps people survive and reproduce. In human history, individuals with higher social status were more successful in obtaining resources, including sexual partners. But of course, not only human, but in the whole animal selection. And since this was the characteristic that made them stand out, they ended up creating more copies of themselves, and we are nothing less than their successors. And for this reason, we have within us the same desire that made our ancestors survive, grow, and reproduce. However, our current society is very different from that which was like in the caveman era, for example. So perhaps due to the greater exposure that we have today, this Darwinian instinct of ours can get out of control, leading to something that was just a desire for attention become an attention complex. For Rammstein, this attention complex is also a way of exerting power over other people, as we said before, which is expressed by the words Ich will in the song. And the way these words are repeated over and over again also demonstrates a huge obsession on the part of the people who want this kind of thing, which is, coincidentally or not, the same obsession that exists on the part of these shooters. Most of them are not people who decide to do this from one moment to the other. As the Columbine massacre shows, many of them end up planning it for a very, very long time. But is this desire for attention all that these people have? After all, if this is something natural in human beings, what would lead some people to take such drastic actions while others seem to deal with it better? Why can't these teenager boys be like her narcissistic aunt or mother who only posts pictures of food on her Instagram and also her body at the gym? In other words, and this is a very common question, do these people have any sort of psychological problem that compels them to do this sort of thing? Well, there's a channel here on YouTube called Criminal Psychology, which has as one of its most watched videos about this school shooter. In the video, the narrator describes a video of the boy's interrogation, and during the entirety of it, right after he committed the attack, we see him disoriented, looking up, not understanding the questions, and saying it's like the demons and the voices made him do it. However, all of this was nothing more than lies, because as soon as the police officer left the room, his posture changes completely, giving the impression that his mental faculties were in fact completely sane. And I think this leads us to the point of this part of the video, which is just because a person commits a crime, it doesn't seem that they have a mental illness. Just imagine how many things happen all the time, and we don't judge everyone as having a psychological problem because of what they did. In fact, it might be even less likely that these people have a per se mental illness. Because as we have seen, many of these murderers, they make plans, they orchestrate various things like blogs on the internet, they write books, and even participate with this with other people. Things that require not only executive functions, but as well as some kind of consciousness and a notion of what they are doing. A second statement parallel to this one that reinforces it would be the opposite, that not everyone with a mental illness commits crimes. And a good example of this are people with antisocial personality, that is, without the disorder. As much as I hate these terminologies because they are extremely superficial and easy to confuse and only occur much less frequently than people believe, for example, it is estimated that 1 1% of the population has this personality as a disorder, and depending on the context in which you live, these numbers may be even lower. The fact is that not all of the antisocials kill people. Some are university professors, like this guy who discovered it after doing a genetic test. Some others can even become doctors. After all, when you describe a person whose profession is to cut people up and deal with blood all the time, a person who makes a living from it and maybe even gets pleasure, it's not very clear whether you're talking about a psychopath or a surgeon. After all, our descriptions of psychopathy as a cold, calculating, and rational person are much more related to a surgeon who needs to stay focused on long periods of time to perform surgeries, while psychopaths often seems to act more impulsively and without self-control. And this is a very interesting thing, because if psychopaths are more impulsive, that means in a way that at least one time or another in our lives, everyone has ever been a psychopath. After all, how many horrible things have you done because at that time, at that moment, it just looked like the right thing to do. Or maybe you didn't even think it through and just decided to go for it. And not even talking about killing people, I'm just talking about saying something that you shouldn't, or having too much drink and ended up texting or even hooking up with someone you certainly shouldn't have. Or even in other cases where you feel so much anger and hatred that you become out of control, a rage so great that you feel or at least speak that you could even kill someone. So what differentiates the motivation of these shooters from these impulsive states of ours, which everyone seems to have at least once in a while? Because at the end of the day, just like you and just like me, these people, they are still people. And if these people are capable of committing such atrocities, what does that mean about you or me? Maybe that you don't want to admit it. Maybe it's just too difficult. But who has never even thought about killing someone at least once in their lives? Not that you have followed through with it or with those plans, but it really shows that to a certain extent, this kind of idea is normal. Of course, thinking about it compulsively just isn't healthy, but the real problem here is when people start doing this sort of things. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung would call this the shadow, the part of our personality that we want to avoid facing and rather would want to hide for whatever reason. The fact that we think we resemble a school shooter to some extent seems quite controversial, but it's also maybe true. As I said before, these people are also people in most of degrees like us, like anyone else in the world. And if many of them do not have any type of psychopathology or disorder that explains their behavior, what leads this anger, this hatred, this planning to become a true act of revenge and of atrocities? But before answering or trying to answer these questions, perhaps it would be better to know the opposite. What do we do when we feel these sorts of emotions? Assuming that anger, hate, and even feelings of inferiority are also normal for every other human being, what do people normally tend to do when they feel these sorts of things? Well, if at least there was some kind of manual to how to be a human being, right? Part 4. Religion and the Bible. So, for thousands of years, even before Christ, human beings have used the Bible as a way to orient themselves in the world. I know I'm not preaching, but it's one of the oldest books in the world. So it may be worth knowing what God says about things after all. First, there is, do not take revenge or bear a grudge against any of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Leviticus 19:80. Not to say, as he has done to me, so I will do to him. I will repay each person accordingly to what he has done. Proverbs 24:29. Do not avenge yourselves, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Romans 12:19. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Romans 12:20. So we can say two things about this. The first is that based on Christian morality, human beings should not commit revenge and leave this only to God, since He will be in charge of all of the universal mathematics as a kind of divine metaphysics. That is, if people commit bad actions, they will have bad results. And you should not do that. Otherwise, the same thing will happen to you. This particularly sounds like those talks about the law of attraction for me, or even karma. And this is interesting because not only does Christianity have these sorts of ideas, but Buddhism and Hinduism do too. The karma is a central notion in Indian religions such as the Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. The word karma means action or deed in Sanskrit, and refers to the idea that all of a person's actions and thoughts have consequences, which can be positive or negative, depending on the nature of those actions and thoughts. According to the belief in karma, every action a person performs generates energy that can influence their present and future life. If a person performs good actions, they accumulate positive karma and will be rewarded with good things in life. On the other hand, if a person performs bad actions, they will accumulate negative karma, and this can lead to negative consequences in life, such as illness, financial problems, or difficulties in relationships. Karma is not seen as a divine punishment, but rather as a natural law that governs the consequences of human actions. According to T's belief, each individual is responsible for his or her own actions, and they should always seek to act in an ethical and morally correct manner in order to accumulate, so to speak, positive karma and have a happy and fulfilled life. Just like in Harry Potter, you know? So even though they are on the other side of the word, they also empathize with the importance of compassion, nonviolence, and especially forgiveness instead of revenge, showing that perhaps these are not just Christian ideologies, but also ways that other cultures and civilizations, and therefore human beings, have found to deal with these issues throughout history. And not only that, you shall hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy, and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:44. But then, should we really never commit any sort of revenge because of this fear that we would have of the divine forces or metaphysical forces or even karma, forces that constitute the very formation and the groundings of the universe and reality itself? Well, if you are an intelligent person, the answer is no. Do not commit revenge. But if you are a genius and you were born in the 19th century and the Catholic Church isn't so influential where you live, perhaps you think of something different. Perhaps you think of writing books to reflect on this, and at the same time to say that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. In the 19th century, a Musterchoid German named Friedrich Nietzsche, that's right, that's how you pronounce his name, was very critical of many groups in society, like psychologists, scientists, religious people, and so on. But much more than criticizing groups specifically, Nietzsche aimed to criticize what motivated people to be in them. That is, the codes and the rules that, in a way, make up those groups. Those things that religious people, philosophers, and perhaps even drug dealers call morality. For Nietzsche, traditional morality, especially the Christian religious morality we mentioned earlier, which spoke of forgiveness and reconciliation, is nothing more than the denial of what he called the will to power, a way of describing what moves us throughout life, a flame that ignites each human being for their own life, creating what existentialists call authenticity. And to achieve this, Nietzsche valued the transvaluation of all values, which is a way of questioning and reevaluating these pre-established values, whether by the church, by current society, or even by sciences, and seeking for yourself a new perspective that evaluates how good and evil correspond to you, to your motivations, to your ways of acting, to your ways of thinking and your life goals. Therefore, some moral ideas of what is right and what is wrong imposed by society, science, or the church could be subjected to interpretation. It should be the sole responsibility of the person who makes that interpretation, as he himself writes. Tatsachen gibt es nicht, nur Interpretationen. Or in English, there are no facts, only interpretations. So, what should be open to interpretation? In a way, everything that we have said up until now in this video. Does it really mean that we should not commit revenge? And if the answer is no, then why? What did a book written 5,000 years ago tell me this? What does this have to do with me? And does what I want for my life not now does not matter? And if you're a Christian, the answer is obviously no. Because even if you wanted to do it, there would be still a divine punishment or karma, if you are Buddhist, that would do something to you. But for Nietzsche, God is dead. God remains dead and we have killed him. So any fear you might have of a higher judgment will certainly not affect or should not affect your decision. And the only one who should really choose whether or not revenge is something that should be done is not even him. It is actually you. So not even society in a sense should interfere with your own judgment. What do you think should be done? What do you intend to achieve by doing it? Why are you doing it? And what will happen when you do it or you don't? Tired of the words reward, retribution, punishment, just revenge. Tired of saying, for an action to be good, it must be disinterested. Oh, my friends, may your being be in the action, as a mother in the child. May these be your words about virtue. Truly, I have taken from you 100 words, and the favorite toys of your virtue. And now you are angry with me as children are angry. A little revenge is more humane than no revenge at all. And if punishment is not also a right and an honor for the transgressor, I do not like your punishments either. Thus spoke Zarathustra. In other words, knowing whether or not you should commit revenge is not up to religion, dogma, or even society, but rather to the individual himself. However, this is not Nietzsche's only view on the subject, because despite saying that this choice is up to you, he does not deny that doing something like this would leave you unharmed. In fact, revenge should also be questioned in terms of its own motivations. For example, why do you want to commit revenge? A simple answer could be because that person did this to me, so I want to pay him back. And the problem with this then would not be the fact of taking revenge itself, but the fact that your revenge is not an attempt to attribute your own desire in the world, but rather to being stagnant to what another person did to you. In other words, is to say that instead of continuing that which was your desire and was interrupted by someone else or some event, many of those who desire revenge and commit it then associate themselves with the desire that was of the other person and that has affected you. Instead of saying what you want, your action then becomes trying to interrupt that what the other person wants, in the same way that happened to you. And for a philosophy that values nothing more than the granting of its own values, of imposing what is called will to power, acting because the other person acted, doing because what the other person did, and leaving one's desire behind to impede the desire of the other, all of this could not be more contrary to what Nietzsche himself, or in this case Zarathustra, could say. Every prisoner becomes a fool. The imprisoned will also redeem itself in a foolish way. The time does not go backwards, it rearranges it. That which was, that is the name of the stone. It cannot move. And so she moves stones out of anger and despair, and takes revenge on those who do not feel, as she does, anger and despair. Thus the will, the liberator, has become the cause of pain, and in everything that can suffer, she takes revenge for not being able to go back. This, and this alone, is revenge itself, the will's aversion to time and its was. Truly, a great madness dwells in our will, and it has become a cure to all that is human, and this madness has acquired its spirit. Thus spoke Zarathustra. In other words, even though Nietzsche says that what the church said about revenge could be reinterpreted personally, he aimed to question beyond the dogma that tells you what is right and what is wrong, what to do and what not to do, to also question your desire, your will, your power of possibility on doing this. It is to question, after all, why are you really doing it? Is it because it pleases you, or is it just because it displeases someone else? After all, these are two different things. On one hand, there is yourself as the focus of your attention, but on the other, there is the other person. In a sense, this last one just contradicts the idea of will to power, which should be something that comes from within to be realized internally, and not from the other, not from without, not from the external, and not from the person who committed the act. In fact, in a similar way, Nietzsche even say that we should see in those who commit to us some kind of evil something good, which seems like a contradiction, and even similar to those ideas of the Christianity of forgiveness and redemption. After all, he said that it is in these attitudes, in these difficulties, in these wars, and in these problems that we, human beings, find our greatest strengths, our greatest motivations, our true authenticity, so to speak. In other words, it would be not the problems themselves that defines us, but what we choose to act and to do with them that defines not only the results, but also us. He writes, "In the friend we must also honor the enemy. Can you get close enough to your friend without going over to the other side? We must have in our friend our best enemy. You must have your heart as close to him as possible when you oppose him." Thus spoke Zarathustra. So in short, Nietzsche's philosophy holds the following. First, to find your own will to power above anything else. And two, to break or to question pre-imposed dogmas which do not come from yourself, whether from the church, society, science, or your parents, and so on. You need to always ask yourself, where does this idea comes from? And third, find precisely in those situations that seem like impediments our strengths, or again, our own will to power. However, even though Nietzsche's philosophy helps us to understand another vision of what to do with those moral values of right and wrong, it hardly tells us where this morality comes from. That is, where does this will to power come from? Where does these motivations that move people to certain actions come from? And so far, we have seen what massacres are, how they are expressed today, some of the forces that motivate people to commit them, and even the morality of committing such things or to not commit them. But the problem here is that we still don't know where does these ideas come from. For example, if it is really negative feelings or anger, hatred, envy, inferiority, revenge, and resentment that generate those actions, we need to ask ourselves, where does these emotions really come from? In his book, Effective Neuroscience, Jacques Van Sepp, one of the greatest and biggest names in neuroscience in the recent years, wrote a chapter just for this anger system of the brain, or rage system, as he calls it. According to him, anger is nothing more than an expectation that has been interrupted. In other words, whenever you have a desire and that desire is interrupted by some other stimuli, whether cognitive or sensorial, you feel anger. In other words, all anger expresses in itself a desire. And we know that in the brain, desires or their greatest source are linked to dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with human motivation and desire, and its activation occurs in the same area of the brain that regulates our most basic instincts, such as thirst, sleep, and hunger, which is called the hypothalamus. In general, the hypothalamus regulates our basic physical and sensorial needs, such as our desires to eat, to drink, and even to sleep. But look how interesting, because one of the other motivations that the hypothalamus regulates is also the sexual motivation. After all, as Charles Darwin and many other biologists said, one of the greatest motivations for life is reproduction itself. After all, we are only here now because a few years ago, two people had to meet, and some time later, we came into being. In other words, whether you like this idea or not, it's saying that sexuality is not only one of the greatest motivations for, human beings, but also for life itself, just as Sigmund Freud warned us but many years ago. Besides dopamine, which is closely associated not only with this excitement of our desires in the hypothalamus, serotonin, another neurotransmitter with receptors that are quite present in the prefrontal cortex, is also very important for regulating our sexual desire. Serotonin is largely a mood stabilizer and tends to be found in abundance in both animals and humans who are in a high status social hierarchy. That is, the famous alpha males, which I pretend to make a video about. For today, let's just say that the serotonin and this high status are very difficult to find in depressed people and are even the main ingredient of many antidepressants. It also makes sense that people who consider themselves or are in a lower status have lower levels of serotonin. That is, having lower levels of emotional stability and exhibiting more erratic behaviors. At the prefrontal cortex, the area where serotonin seems to act in a greater abundance, is also one of the most evolved areas, so to speak, and that differentiate we human beings from almost any other animal on the planet. One of the things that this part of the brain does is inhibiting these areas linked to dopamine in the hypothalamus. In other words, it is one of the main calmers of our instinctual motivations. And for neuroscientists, this raises the following question. What happens then when we, human beings, are deprived of our basic needs? What happens when people are unable to satisfy these desires and these instincts? Well, according to Panksepp, this is where our feelings of anger and aggression arise. That is, we move from these higher areas of the brain that demand more energy to those that act faster, the lower and the more instinctive areas of the brain. Because even if it made sense that this scarcity would reduce human motivation, the opposite is actually what happens. The deprivation of our basic needs generates an intensification of motivation and an even more intense surge to satisfy these needs, and several stories and scientific experiments show exactly this. The semiotic hunger experiment, for example, involved healthy volunteers being subjected to a state of severe caloric deprivation to stimulate the conditions of food scarcity faced during wartime. Participants experienced a strong motivation towards food, as well as obsessive thoughts about it, exhibiting food-seeking behaviors and even fantasies related to the food. Aaron Ralston, an American climber, ended up getting trapped in 2003, and after 5 days trapped, with no hope of being rescued, little water, and no food, he ended up deciding to amputate his own arm with a knife so that he wouldn't die there in that place. An extremely brutal act, which he certainly wouldn't have done unless he was in this situation. And for me, one of the most interesting experiments is that if male mice are isolated in small cages for several weeks, about half of them develop hyperactivity and unusually aggressive behavior when they encounter other mice. Although this social deprivation has no effect on the level of serotonin in the brain, it does reduce the rate of serotonin turnover, causing the mice to have aggressive instability. However, this only happens to male mice, because when females are also isolated, they do not become aggressive or show a decrease in the rate of serotonin reuptake. All examples illustrate how the deprivation of a basic need, be it for water, food, socialization, or even sexual satisfaction, can trigger intense motivation and direct behavior in search of satisfying that need, or in the case of the latter, to discharge those feelings. While dopamine and the hypothalamus increase their activity to motivate us to satisfy those needs, serotonin and the prefrontal cortex, which makes us more human beings, so to speak, and normally inhibit those needs, tend to have a much lower level of activity in these cases. In other words, this constant lack, this constant frustration of something is one of the things that most motivates us to take actions that we normally wouldn't take if we were completely satisfied. Who knows? Not only with our basic needs, but also with those of life, such as socialization, work, self-esteem, a vision for the future. Those from Maslow's pyramid, which are in a certain way also all human needs. But moving from the universal to the particular, there is a problem with this theory. If it were just not having your needs met that specifically motivated you to commit murder, what would explain that 97% of the school shootings in the US were carried out by men alone, not women? Perhaps another case of school massacre can help us answer these questions. This time, the case of Elliot Rodger. Rodger was a young American who became known for committing a violent attack at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2014. This attack resulted in the death of 6 people and left several others injured. Elliot also showed signs of social isolation, low self-esteem, and intense feelings of inadequacy, which corroborate to our previous views on the inferiority complex in these people. He also felt that he did not fit into the established standards of beauty and social success, and consequently developed a deep bitterness and resentment towards others. And just like in the case of Columbine, Elliot left behind several writings and videos in which he expressed anger and hatred. But the biggest difference here will be his motivation, as much of these feelings came from a greater frustration towards or regarding women, from whom he blamed for his loneliness and rejection. The day of retribution is my attempt to destroy everything I cannot have. However, this retribution did not come only towards women. As one of the videos he made shortly before his massacre, he talked about what the internet in the slangs call the Chads, or as he describes them, the cavemen who hit on women and for some reason they still decide to stay with them. And this is what led Elliot to have a great moral conflict in his head, because for him, those men who were successful were, at least with women, were only perverts who cared only about sex. They were superficial, narcissistic, and insensitive. And in a way, Eliot felt that he was not like them. He believed that if he didn't do these things, if he didn't hit on women or cared about sex like these guys do, maybe, just maybe, that will make him a good person, or even having women after him. After all, in his mind, if these were the bad values to have, then wouldn't the opposite of then be what is truly good? Well, according to our friend Friedrich Nietzsche, it is no. Because besides talking about revenge, Nietzsche also describes in his books, The Genealogy of Morals, what he calls this Slavenmoral, or the slave morality. A morality, and here we go again, developed by Christians who Nietzsche referred to as weak and envious, and who, because they did not have great qualities or characteristics, were judging the noble, the strong, and the powerful, because in this way they achieve two things. First, to look down on these individuals, and to second, stay at the same height as them. That is, instead of these people trying to be better, they will simply destroy everything that they see on top, so that everything is on the same level as them. And once these people already demonstrate such poor self-esteem, self-worth, the only place that things can go is down. So when people present some characteristic, there end up being other people who will see these characteristics as bad, and imagine that the opposite of them will be the better or the good. But this is not true at all. After all, if you were only doing the opposite, you would only be doing the same thing, but in an opposite way. You know, something that could not go further against Nietzsche's own philosophy, which in turn preached the constant questioning of morality. Instead of simply acting on it, whether in a good or bad way, the important thing would be to go beyond these concepts, in other words, go beyond good and evil. So all the previous feelings of anger, hatred, and revenge were present, and all these feelings still suffered from great bipolarization. That is, either people were all good or they were all bad. Psychoanalyst Melanie Klein called this splitting, a term that defines people who have a difficulty in seeing shades of gray. And because of this, they end up seeing everything in the very extremes, often as a way of having excuses to do what they wanted in the first place, or to simply not seeing what they could have done instead. That is, to resolve the situation and not to be bounded by the first action of to whomever made it in the first place. In short, Eliot displayed traits of distorted thinking, such as a belief in his own superiority, and ironically, a belief in entitlement towards women, just like, Bowser and Ganondorf, the villains in fiction. And despite his similarities between the Columbine shooters and Eliot, several differences are also noticeable. For example, while the Columbine shooters aimed and desired people's attention, Elliot Rodgers, who acted by a twisted morality, aiming to get rid of the troglodytes, troglodyte. After all, if God was not going to carry out some kind of cosmic and divine punishment or revenge, it would be up to him to do it himself. And this view of distorted morality is unfortunately more common than one might imagine, especially among people who commit attacks like this. One of the most famous is Ted Kaczynski himself, also known as the Unabomber, who wrote a huge manifesto called The Industrial Society and Its Future, which preached how increasing technological evolution had corrupted what makes us human beings, and with that led to a growing wave of nihilism and depression, which, in a way, makes a lot of sense. But Kaczynski was not a simply teenager who masturbated every day and lived in his mother's basement, because in addition to all of that, he was also a great intellectual who had graduated with above average grades from Harvard, one of the best universities in the United States, and obtained an IQ score of 162, which is above almost 99% of the population. And the real problem was the solution that Krasinski had for his manifesto. Because if technology and current society were to blame, it would make sense that everything would be destroyed and the world would start from scratch. A little curiosity is that Krasinski has the same personality traits as several other intellectual thinkers such as Thanos and Karl Marx, who also held similar ideas. What interesting. In the end, Krasinski rejected society and decided to live in the middle of nowhere. And for almost 30 years, he remained hidden, sending bombs to famous people and organizations hoping to make some change in society. Perhaps acting out of pure hatred and resentment of the way the world was built, or more specifically, to not being someone someone very important in this world. And this might sound weird, but I believe we can actually differentiate these people into two distinct categories. The first being the Ich-Willers, like Columbine shooters, and the second one the Unabombers, as Elliot Rodger and Ted Krasinski. For a while, the Ich-Willers are motivated by the desire of attention as histrionics. The Unabombers aim to exact retribution on society because of a distorted morality. Even though in both cases there are actions of resentment, anguish, and resentment about life, which is apparently used to commit catastrophic actions against society itself, a type of internal feeling which is expressed externally. But none of this answers the question, why men and not women? Well, if you're a biologist, you can probably suggest a link between testosterone, a typically male hormone, and higher levels of physical aggression, and anger in men. However, as Professor Robert Sapolsky of Stanford University points out, testosterone is not specifically a cause of stress. In fact, it has a different effect. After all, for almost everything that we men do that generates great emotions, when we look at ourselves, it is possible to see the relationship between testosterone and our bloodstream. So what does this testosterone really do? One of Sapolsky's own explanation is that it is closely associated with learning. Being more specific is saying that if you are already a man who is aggressive or has aggressiveness within you and has a tendency to express his aggressiveness, what testosterone really does is to help you reinforce what already exists within you. More specifically, even, it can serve as a potentializer of things that are already intrinsic to man and that generate benefits for him. But this goes deeper into the area of learning and social expression, which we'll discuss later. For now, we can make another association, that although testosterone is not directly related to aggression, it does have a direct connection with another human need, which is sexuality. And as we saw earlier, although it is easy to think that massacres are often motivated by anger and revenge, what creates these feelings, these physiological feelings, is in fact the lack of some unmet desire or need. One of these desires and needs being, for example, that of the sexual desire. And that's where things get even more interesting, because there is, in common sense, this idea that men seem to like sex more than women, or at least think more about it than women do. But according to statistical and scientific data, that seems to be true. For example, in a ABC News survey, 70% of men reported thinking about sex every day, while 30% of women say the same. And you might think, well, maybe women were lying. After all, maybe it's embarrassing for women to admit it, while for men, it's a way of saying what they want and maybe even getting it. Well, maybe, but thinking about this possibility, a very interesting study even showed sexually explicit videos to some participants while recording responses from their genitals and the brain. and then asked, "Did you find this video sexually stimulating?" On a scale of 0 to 2, 1.6 or 80% of the men responded that yes, the video was indeed sexually arousing. But when looking at women, only 25% of them responded that yes, the video was sexually arousing. But here's the thing. When looking at the genital response of each one, 90% of the men seem to register an arousal response, or 10% more than expected, while 65% of the women register such a response, that is 40% more than they had previously reported. In another study, men and women were approached and asked 3 questions. First, if they would like to go out on a date. 2, if they would like to go home or to the apartment with the person asking. And lastly, if they would like to have sex with the person. For the first question, 37% of men said yes, compared to 31% of women. For the second question, about going back to the apartment, 57% of men said yes, while 18% of women say the same. And for the last question, about having sex, 58% of men accepted the invitation, while only 1% of women did the same. Now, the point of all of this research is to say that despite the differences, men still seem to have greater sexual arousal and openness than women, especially regarding the first experiment. Another difference for this is the college effect, which shows something similar. Some other data are also about sex in relationships, because when measuring the differences between heterosexual and homosexual couples, it was discovered that gay men were the couples that had the most sex with each other, with almost 70% reporting having sex 3 or more times a week, compared to 45% of heterosexual couples with a man and a woman, and 33% of lesbian couples. Now, the point of all of this research is to say that despite the differences, men still have greater sexual arousal and openness than women do, especially regarding the first experiment. Like if men were to be much more visual and mediate when it comes to sexual arousal, while women seem to be more literary and prefer stories or even their imagination rather than visual images. Which is to say that women seems to need more or a further development to have the same levels of arousal as a man. Interestingly, testosterone levels in men, which peak around their 20s, are also linked to greater sexuality in men during that age. Imagining how perhaps this greater male sexual motivation not only balances this of the female one, but also imagines that the fact that men have a greater sexual desire than women could be linked to a greater frustration of not being able to have sex more frequently, and consequently generate that anger that we spoke about earlier. Well, that's the biggest theory right now. However, even if this explains the higher incidence in men, it does not explain why women, when they are sexually frustrated, do not commit the same type of actions. After all, even if it is not the same, to the same extent at least, women still have their sexuality. But what do women do when they are sexually frustrated? In recent years, some movements just apparently have been gained more voice. For example, in Europe, it is quite common for environmental activists to go to museums and art galleries and throw paint or food at artworks or art that are extremely valuable to humanity. Even if these individuals have an interesting message to offer, they can often end up opting for extreme questionable methods, such as vandalism and radical attitudes. And to analyze this, psychoanalysis offers us a very interesting perspective. Because one of the things that motivated Freud to create psychoanalysis was exactly the studies of what he called hysteria. This hysteria is a word that comes from the Greek and means exactly uterus, more specifically an empty womb. Because in the past, believe it or not, people actually thought that only women could have it. Hysteria was a form of illness that many doctors, even in Freud's time, believed to be nothing more than a falsehood. whether it was from a woman who simply wanted to attract attention, to gain pity, or escape from the responsibilities of life at the time, such as working, taking care of the house, or even children. It was then accompanied mostly by physical symptoms that were inexplicable and that always seemed to be very dramatic, but very rapid and unstable changes in mood, sometimes with even the identification with another person's symptoms. That is, imagining or seeing someone with a back pain, with tremors, and so on, caused a type of contagion of what the other person had to the hysteric herself. Freud's greatest insight was to associate the symptoms of hysteria not only as symptoms or with the physical ones, but also as messages that sometimes communicated deeper problems. In this way, events from a person's past caused certain psychological scars, which sometimes also became physical problems, even without seeming to have an apparent cause. Something that at the time seemed to be revolutionary. And that the way to cure this, so to speak, would then be through the recall of these events, through the spoken word. In other words, it will be providing the person with exactly what they previously were avoiding doing. In the same way that the word pharmakon, from the Greek, which gives rise to pharmacy or to medicine, means both cure or poison. The medicine for the hysteria in this sense will be exactly to expose the person to what caused her illness. And imagining that what caused the hysterical illness would probably be this putting too many things on the inside, keeping too much for themselves, the treatment will be exactly to put these things out into the light, to bring what the person made unconscious into the consciousness, revealing these things to themselves. We find the same longing as one of the basic factors of a great historical institution, the Roman Catholic confessional. Saying things is a relief. It discharges tension, even when the person to whom they are said is not a priest, and even when no absolution is sought. When this outlet is denied to excitement, it sometimes becomes a somatic phenomenon, as happens with the excitement pertaining to traumatic effects. Studies on hysteria. He that has eyes to see and ears to hear may convince himself that no mortal can keep a secret. If his lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips. Betrayal oozes out of him at every pore. 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. However, for Freud, many of these inhibitions were nothing more or less than inhibitions, mostly sexual, that is, when a person had a sexual desire, a thought, or an excitement, which he later called libido, and this person tried to deny to themselves that this is happening, and instead of declaring, admitting, and getting it out, thus making this desire inhibited, it would then, this libido, be transformed into some kind of psychological symptom. Here, for example, the so-called hysteria. This is why the treatment will be linked to admitting that whether you like it or not, you, me, and everyone else has these desires, and that continuing to keep them inside, to inhibiting them, certainly does not bring any benefit. On the contrary, in addition to creating the hysteria, doing this also distances you from what you really want in life. Indeed, the first appearance of sexual feelings and representations is often sufficient in itself to bring about an intense state of excitement, because of its conflict with the deeply rooted representation of moral purity. A state of excitement of this nature is usually followed by psychic consequences, such as pathological depression and states of anxiety. Sometimes, however, certain coincidental circumstances bring about an abnormal somatic phenomenon in which the excitement is discharged. Thus, there may be vomiting when the feeling of impurity produces physical sensation of nausea, or a nervous cough, as in Anna O, when moral anxiety provokes a spasm of the glutens, and so on. Considering that most radical climate activists are women, for example, their questionable behaviors and cries of despair through their activism could indeed be examples of these repressed emotions that are expressed in unsociable ways. As Freud himself writes, when the lips are silent, people scream in different ways. And after all, what would be the best way to scream if not literally? Like a baby that cries and screams when struggling to receive care, what does women want when they do the same things in museums, in public spaces, or even on the internet? What need might not be being met for them to do this sort of thing, this kind of thing that most people clearly would not do it? Well, for Freud, the psychoanalytic approach and all of the reports we've seen in this video so far, could it be that in the same way that men are driven to aggression, women would also be driven to hysteria because of sexual inhibition or sexual frustration? Well, that's the idea. That being the case, it would be quite easy to associate social activists not only with a female version of school shooters, but also with the hysterics described by Freud, since they also present these types of repressed emotions and a greater difficulty in expressing them in a healthy way in the world. This way of dealing with your emotions and your desires for Freud would be called repression. But for Nietzsche, it would be called resentment, which he relates to the myth of Lucifer, the fallen angel. Lucifer, who was one of the most powerful and beautiful angels who served God in heaven, was nevertheless very arrogant and desired to be equal to God, to the point of wanting his downfall. And because of all of his envy and resentment, Lucifer ends up carrying out a celestial rebellion, which caused him to be banished to hell, which can be interpreted in two ways. The first is the Christian view of hell as a real place. But the second is that in truth, hell is just a symbolical way for representing the results of Lucifer's actions. That is, if a person full of hate, envy, and resentment starts seeking revenge, the only thing that they can achieve with this is to be in an even worse place. It is the same as that idea of ours of the negative emotions producing negative results. Thus, resentment can be fueled by a sense of injustice and inferiority, leading to a search for retaliation against those who are perceived as privileged or superior. In the case of Lucifer, it would be God. In the case of climate activists, it would be the rich who invest in art museums. And in the case of school shooters, it could be the whole society, women, their classmates, and so on. Which leads us to understand some of the motivations of these shooters. Because if Freudian hysteria is in fact a form of sexual frustration, and this frustration, as we saw with Elliot Rodgers, may be one of the reasons for these massacres, could this sexual frustration in men be one of the biggest motivations for this kind of thing? Well, as we saw earlier, society tends to help us regulate these impulses. And again, it is not just because you're a man or just because you're not having some desire, whether sexual or otherwise met, that you become a criminal. This just leads us to open to a new question. That is, could the same society also influences us to have these types of impulses? In other words, how much of social stimuli besides religion, besides laws, besides philosophy, can be related to these behaviors? And unfortunately, I think this will need to be for another video, because this one is already a little bit long. Even though I promised to talk about video games in this video, I will probably need a part 2 to end it all up. But for today, we're just gonna end up with these ideas. Could it be that a sexual frustration is the mainly cause for school shooting attacks?